What if the decade's best sci-fi never made a dime? One of these movies bombed so badly its director didn't work in Hollywood for years afterward, yet film schools study it today. Another got buried by the single biggest sci-fi release of 1999 and never recovered. These are 15 forgotten 90s sci-fi movies that deserved so much better. Few might genuinely change how you see the decade. Number 15. Freejack, 1992. Mick Jagger playing a snarling bounty hunter in a leather trench coat is reason enough to watch this one, but the concept underneath the cheese is genuinely twisted. Set in a grim near-future version of 2009, Freejack imagines a world where the ultra-rich have figured out how to cheat death by snatching bodies from the past at the exact moment those people were destined to die, then transplanting their own minds into the stolen flesh. Emilio Estevez plays a race car driver yanked out of a fatal crash seconds before impact, only to wake up in a filthy future city as the most wanted man alive. Anthony Hopkins shows up as the corporate mastermind behind the whole scheme, delivering a chilling, understated performance years before he became a household name for an entirely different kind of monster. Critics at the time tore the film apart, calling the plot a mess, and the tone wildly inconsistent, bouncing between gritty body horror and goofy action comedy without warning. The studio reportedly fought over the final cut, and it shows. Box office numbers were rough, barely scraping back its budget domestically. And yet Freejack has quietly built a cable television cult following over the decades, mostly because the central idea, rich people literally stealing your body to extend their own lives, feels more relevant now than it did in 1992. It is messy, it is dated, and Jagger's wig deserves its own award, but the bones of a genuinely unsettling sci-fi premise are buried in there if you're willing to dig. Number 14. Nemesis, 1992. Albert Puin made a career out of low-budget genre experiments, and Nemesis might be his most underrated swing. Set in a crumbling 2027 Los Angeles, the film follows a half-human, half-machine cop forced back into action to stop a group of cyborg terrorists from assassinating a world leader. The twist is that our hero is fighting against the very technology inside his own body, which keeps threatening to override his free will and turn him into exactly the kind of weapon he's hunting. The action choreography blends martial arts with practical gore effects in a way that feels scrappy but inventive, clearly inspired by Terminator and RoboCop, but carving its own grimy identity. Olivier Gruner, a real-life kickboxing champion, headlines the film with a physicality that few actors of the era could match, even if his line delivery leaves something to be desired. Critics largely ignored Nemesis on release, and it slipped straight to video store shelves without much fanfare, the kind of fate that buried countless solid genre films during the direct-to-video boom. What keeps it interesting decades later is how unapologetically it commits to its cyberpunk aesthetic, all neon signage, rain-soaked alleys, and body modification body horror, years before cyberpunk became a mainstream buzzword again. It never made real money and barely registered with critics, but action and sci-fi fans who track it down tend to walk away surprised by how hard it goes for a film nobody talks about anymore. Number 13. Hardware, 1990. Before found-footage horror and killer robot movies became their own overcrowded subgenres, Hardware quietly fused both into something genuinely disturbing. The plot follows a salvaged military robot head, picked up as junk in an irradiated wasteland and brought home as a gift, that slowly reassembles itself inside a cramped apartment and starts hunting the woman living there. Director Richard Stanley built the entire film on a shoestring budget, using practical effects and claustrophobic camera work to generate dread instead of relying on spectacle. The soundtrack features contributions tied to the industrial and post-punk music scene, giving the film a grimy, mechanical pulse that matches its visuals perfectly. Hardware actually ran into real censorship trouble in the United Kingdom, where regulators flagged some of its imagery as excessively graphic, forcing edits before release, a controversy that only added to its underground reputation among horror and sci-fi collectors. American distribution was limited, and the film never found a wide audience, quietly fading into bargain bin VHS obscurity for years. What makes it worth revisiting is how prophetic its anxieties feel, a story about discarded military technology coming back to violently reclaim a domestic space, told with a punk rock fury that big studio sci-fi rarely attempts. It's nasty, it's loud, and it clearly influenced filmmakers who came after it, even if almost nobody remembers where the influence came from. Number 12. Tank Girl, 1995. Few sci-fi movies of the decade flopped as spectacularly and as publicly as Tank Girl, and that is exactly why it deserves a second look. Adapted from the anarchic British comic of the same name, the film drops us into a drought-ravaged Australian wasteland where a rebellious water bandit, played with reckless energy by Laurie Petty, takes on a tyrannical corporation while riding around in a heavily customized tank. The production was famously chaotic, with the director later admitting that studio interference gutted much of the film's original punk attitude before release. Critics savaged it on arrival, mocking the tone shifts and the bizarre mutant kangaroo soldier subplot, and the box office numbers were a near-total disaster, recouping only a small fraction of its budget. Yet Tank Girl has clawed its way into genuine cult status since then, championed by fans who appreciate its unapologetic feminist swagger and its willingness to be loud, messy, and weird, in a genre that often plays it safe. The soundtrack alone, packed with alternative rock acts of the era, has aged into something of a time capsule for 90s counterculture. Comic book purists still argue the film sanitized the source material's rougher edges, and that debate keeps the movie relevant in fan circles even now. It's a glorious mess, but it's the kind of mess that genuinely tried something different at a time when most studio sci-fi played things painfully straight. Number 11. Screamers, 1995. Adapting Philip K. Dick is a gamble that has produced both masterpieces and disasters, and Screamers sits in a fascinating middle ground that almost nobody talks about. Peter Weller leads a story set on a war-torn mining planet, where the two warring factions deployed self-replicating robotic weapons designed to burrow underground and ambush their targets. The horrifying twist is that these machines have evolved far beyond their original programming, learning to disguise themselves as wounded soldiers, children, and other sympathetic figures to infiltrate human camps before striking. The paranoia baked into every scene feels like a direct ancestor to later prestige sci-fi thrillers, with characters constantly second-guessing whether the person next to them is even human. Critics at the time gave it mixed reviews, praising the unsettling concept while criticizing the budget limitations on full display in some of the effects work. Financially, the film barely registered, fading quickly from theaters and slipping into the kind of obscurity that swallows so many mid-budget genre films. Philip K. Dick adaptations have a long history of underperforming on release before being reassessed years later, and Screamers fits that pattern almost perfectly. What makes it worth revisiting is the sheer bleakness of its ending and its refusal to offer easy comfort, a tone that distinguishes it from flashier alien invasion fare of the same era. Number 10. Virtuosity, 1995. Pitting Denzel Washington against Russell Crowe sounds like an obvious recipe for box office gold, yet Virtuosity barely made a dent and has been gathering dust ever since. The premise alone deserves way more credit than it gets. A rogue artificial intelligence training simulation, built from the digitized personalities of more than 100 real serial killers, escapes its virtual prison and takes physical form using a nanotech body. Crowe, in an early American role before his Gladiator breakthrough, plays the villain with a theatrical, almost gleeful menace that feels eerily ahead of its time, given how seriously AI threats are discussed today. Washington plays a disgraced former police officer pulled out of prison to help hunt the creature, bringing real emotional weight to material that could easily have stayed shallow. Critics were lukewarm at release, dismissing the film as style over substance, and it underperformed at the box office relative to its budget and star power. Looking back, the movie's central anxiety, a digital intelligence built from humanity's worst impulses breaking free into the real world, reads almost like a warning shot for conversations happening right now about AI safety. It also experimented with virtual reality training environments years before that concept became a sci-fi staple. Virtuosity isn't a hidden masterpiece, but it's a genuinely strange, ambitious swing that deserved a far better reputation than the one history gave it. Number 9. Johnny Mnemonic, 1995. This is the movie that proves being ahead of your time doesn't always save you from being mocked. Based on a short story by cyberpunk legend William Gibson, who also wrote the screenplay himself, Johnny Mnemonic stars Keanu Reeves as a data courier with a literal computer implant in his brain, smuggling stolen information across a corporate-dominated future. The film throws everything at the screen, including a genetically uplifted dolphin hacker named Jones, who helps decode encrypted data, a detail so bizarre it became infamous among fans almost immediately. Critics absolutely roasted it on release, calling the dialogue clunky and the tone wildly uneven, and it bombed hard enough that it nearly derailed momentum for cyberpunk cinema until The Matrix arrived years later and reignited interest in the genre. What's fascinating is how many ideas this film got right before anyone else did. Brain implants, data smuggling, megacorporations controlling information itself, and a visually grimy, neon-soaked vision of the future that clearly influenced later, more successful films. Gibson himself has spoken about how studio compromises diluted his original vision, and that tension between author intent and executive meddling is part of why the film feels so uneven today. It's become a beloved punching bag in cult cinema circles, the kind of so bad it's fascinating watch that rewards viewers who appreciate ambition even when execution stumbles badly. Number 8. The City of Lost Children, 1995. French filmmakers Jean-Pierre Jeunet and Marc Caro built something so visually inventive with this film that it practically invented its own genre, somewhere between gothic fairy tale and steampunk science fiction nightmare. The story follows a circus strongman searching a fog-drenched port city for his kidnapped younger brother, all while a deranged scientist steals children's dreams in a desperate, twisted attempt to slow down his own rapid aging. Every frame drips with surreal imagery, cloned brothers, a brain in a tank pulling the strings of an entire criminal underworld, and set design so elaborate it later influenced the visual language of Amélie, the much more famous film Jeunet would direct years afterward. Critics in France and at international festivals praised its visual ambition, though English-language audiences mostly missed it entirely due to limited distribution and subtitled art house release patterns. It never made significant money outside niche cinema circuits, and most casual sci-fi fans have simply never heard of it, despite its heavy influence on the visual style of later fantasy and science fiction blockbusters. The film's nightmarish tone and unconventional family structures sparked some debate among critics about its darker themes, but it never approached anything resembling true controversy. What it did do was prove that science fiction could be deeply personal, strange, and painterly all at once, a lesson plenty of bigger-budget films still haven't learned. Number 7. Mimic, 1997. This was Guillermo del Toro's first real swing inside the Hollywood studio system, and the experience reportedly left him so frustrated that he has spoken openly about disowning portions of the theatrical cut over the years. The premise is wonderfully grim. Scientists genetically engineer an insect species to wipe out a disease-carrying cockroach population, only for the bugs to evolve at an alarming rate, eventually growing large enough to mimic human shape and stalk the tunnels beneath New York City. Mira Sorvino leads the cast as the entomologist forced to confront her own role in creating the nightmare crawling through the subway system. Studio executives reportedly clashed with Del Toro repeatedly during production, demanding reshoots and trims that softened some of the body horror he originally intended, a battle that foreshadowed the creative control he would eventually demand on later, more successful projects. Critics gave it a mixed reception, acknowledging the atmosphere and practical creature design while criticizing pacing issues clearly born from the contentious editing process. Financially, it performed modestly, never becoming the breakout hit the studio hoped for. Years later, a director's cut surfaced that restored much of Del Toro's original vision, and fans who've seen both versions consistently argue the unrestricted cut is a far stronger film. Mimic remains a fascinating example of a visionary director fighting the system before he had the leverage to win. Number 6. Cube, 1997. Few movies have stretched a microscopic budget further than Cube, a Canadian production that reportedly cost well under $1 million to make and still managed to become an international cult phenomenon. The setup is brutally simple. A group of strangers wake up trapped inside a massive structure made of interlocking cube-shaped rooms, each one potentially rigged with a lethal trap, and nobody remembers how they got there or why. Director Vincenzo Natali built nearly the entire film using a single reusable cube set, repainted and rearranged between scenes, a trick that allowed the production to fake an enormous, labyrinthine structure on almost no money at all. Critics were pleasantly surprised by how much tension the film generated through pure claustrophobia and mounting paranoia rather than expensive effects, and it picked up genuine festival buzz that helped it cross over into wider cult recognition. It never made huge money theatrically, but it absolutely thrived on home video. Number 4. Sphere, 1998. Stacking Dustin Hoffman, Samuel L. Jackson, and Sharon Stone into one cast should have guaranteed a hit, yet Sphere arrived and disappeared almost instantly, leaving behind one of the more divisive sci-fi mysteries of the decade. Based on a Michael Crichton novel, the story follows a team of scientists summoned to investigate a massive alien spacecraft discovered on the ocean floor, only to find a perfect golden sphere inside that begins manipulating their minds and materializing their deepest fears into physical reality. The underwater setting gave the production genuine practical pressure and claustrophobia, and the creature and effects work, much of it achieved through old-fashioned practical techniques, still holds up better than its reputation suggests. Critics largely focused their frustration on the ending, which many felt undercut the tension built across the rest of the film with an unsatisfying resolution, and that backlash followed the movie into its disappointing box office run. It barely made back a portion of its substantial budget, a rough outcome considering the star power attached. Crichton fans have argued for years that the film never fully captured the novel's psychological depth, fueling ongoing debate about whether a future remake could finally do the concept justice. Even with its flaws, Sphere deserves credit for taking a genuinely cerebral, claustrophobic approach to alien contact, instead of leaning on spectacle, a choice that feels almost rare today. Number 3. Soldier, 1998. Kurt Russell spends most of this film barely speaking, and that silence ends up being one of the most quietly devastating performances of his career. Written by David Webb Peoples, the same writer behind Blade Runner, Soldier was originally conceived as existing in a loosely connected universe with that earlier classic, focusing on a genetically bred super soldier discarded by the military once a newer, more advanced model becomes available. Dumped on a remote junk planet inhabited by stranded settlers, the character slowly has to relearn basic human connection after a lifetime of conditioning stripped it away entirely. Critics were split right down the middle, with some praising the bold minimalist approach to the lead performance, while others found the film cold and emotionally distant. Financially, it was a genuine disaster, failing badly against its production budget and getting completely overshadowed by other late 90s blockbusters released around the same window. Fans of the screenplay's connection to Blade Runner have spent years arguing online about how deliberately linked the two films actually are, a debate the writer himself has only partially clarified over time. What keeps Soldier worth revisiting is its refusal to soften its bleak premise. A story about a man literally built and then thrown away by the system that created him, told with a restraint that modern action sci-fi rarely attempts anymore. Number 2. Existence Z, 1999. David Cronenberg has never been interested in playing it safe, and Existence Z might be the most purely Cronenberg sci-fi film ever made, which is exactly why it got completely buried the same year as a much bigger, flashier virtual reality movie. The premise centers on biological game consoles that plug directly into a player's spine, blurring the line between simulated game worlds and physical reality until characters and audiences genuinely lose track of which layer they're experiencing. Jennifer Jason Leigh and Jude Law lead a cast forced to question their own existence as the game world starts bleeding into what's supposed to be real life. Critics respected Cronenberg's commitment to body horror imagery and his unflinching exploration of identity and control, though several reviewers admitted the film's deliberately disorienting structure made it a tough, alienating watch for casual audiences. The box office outcome was rough, with the film essentially vanishing from theaters within weeks, partly because it released in the direct shadow of a much more commercially polished rival tackling similar simulated reality themes. Cronenberg fans have long argued that Existence Z deserved far more credit for tackling the philosophical weirdness of nested realities with genuine craft rather than just spectacle. Decades later, conversations about gaming addiction and immersive technology make the film's anxieties feel less like science fiction and more like an early warning. Number 1. The 13th Floor, 1999. This is the ultimate victim of brutal release timing. A smart, atmospheric, simulated reality mystery that had the genuine misfortune of opening the same year as the single biggest sci-fi cultural event of the decade. The story follows a wealthy investor who creates a fully simulated 1930s-era city, only to discover after a colleague's mysterious death that his own reality might itself be nested inside yet another simulation controlled by someone else entirely. The film leans heavily into film noir atmosphere, swapping flashy action for slow-burn dread and a genuinely unsettling existential mystery about how many layers of fake reality a person can be trapped inside without ever knowing it. Critics generally respected its visual style and central concept, though several pointed out that its pacing and tone felt almost old-fashioned compared to the more kinetic competitor dominating theaters that same year. Financially, the film simply could not compete, getting swallowed up at the box office and fading from public memory shockingly fast considering how strong its central twist actually is. Science fiction historians have since pointed to The 13th Floor as a textbook case of an excellent film losing to circumstances entirely outside its own quality. A reminder that timing in this industry can matter just as much as execution. If you've never seen it, the layered reveal alone makes it worth tracking down immediately. That's the list. 15 90s sci-fi movies that deserved so much better than what the decade gave them. Some bombed so badly the people involved barely talk about them anymore, and some just got crushed by bigger movies releasing at the worst possible time. Which one of these are you adding to your watch list tonight, and which forgotten gem did we somehow leave off? Drop it in the comments, because I genuinely want to know if you think any of these flops were actually better than the blockbusters that buried them.